Hi there, Agile friends. I'll come in here just with a quick note to let you know that the Agile Online Summit 2022 is coming soon. To know more, check out bit.ly/AOS2022. That's all one word, all lowercase, bit.ly/AOS2022. Now, stick around to the end of the episode if you want to know more, but for now, on to the show. Hello everybody, welcome to one major bonus episode with Stephan Wiedner. We'll be talking about a hot topic in Agile teams these days, psychological safety. Hey Stephan, welcome to the show.
Hi Vasco, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Stephan's been working with psychological safety for a long time. He's an expert in psychological safety and has focused on developing sustainable high-performance leaders, teams, and organizations. He's worked with several companies linked to coaching and psychological safety support for teams and organizations. And of course, he's also a guest speaker at different organizations, conferences. And his writing has been featured in Forbes, Entrepreneur, and other popular publications. Stephan is married with 2 children, enjoys spending quality time in the outdoors, which I hear is excellent weather over there in Canada where he is right now, and also loves hiking, biking, camping, and reading. I imagine a psychological safety expert reads a lot these days, Stephan.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's always new information, and I like to stay abreast of what's current.
Absolutely. So one of the features of your bio is that you've worked with many different companies, startups, developing products and services. And that's something that we do all the time. And I know that you have some interesting lessons to share with us. So why don't we start there? What did you learn from that life as an entrepreneur, as a startup co-founder, and of course also somebody who went through that product development experience firsthand?
Yeah, thanks, Vasco. So back in 2007 is when I started my entrepreneurial journey. So my business partner and I, we started up a company, and we were really interested in the convergence of psychology, business, and software or technology. So what we wanted to do is develop an application to bring coaching online. And at the time, we knew someone was going to do something in that space. And our innovation was to develop a platform where any 2 people could coach each other. So that was our innovation. It's sort of like your gym buddy for your life on this application. And so what did we do? Well, we went behind closed doors and we put our heads down and we started to design a product. We hired developers and we created wireframes and got them to write the code. And every time we came up with an idea, we implemented it because it seemed like it was absolutely necessary. And so, 12 months, 14 months later, we thought, oh gosh, let's open this up to the world. I think we finally have a valuable product that we can launch with. And sure, we got some exciting news. We were featured on TechCrunch and a couple other places, and got a flood of activity. People showed up, and then they left. So the application had some fundamental flaws because we made these massive assumptions. And right about that time, Eric Ries was starting this whole lean startup thing. And he came to Vancouver, and our CTO at the time, he said, I think we should go check out this talk because this guy's kind of flipping business on its head. And so we go to this talk. There's maybe 25 people in the room, and he has on the wall, I remember, the waterfall approach versus the agile approach. And he had the 3 steps, right, where you do something, you collect data, you get the feedback, and then you try something new, and you just sort of repeat that cycle. And the whole point of it was to iterate as much as possible. And that was completely revolutionary. We're like, oh yeah, man.
Instead of being behind closed doors for a year, to actually do something in small increments. And if you would have to describe what was your major takeaway that you then later perhaps applied in other organizations and startups you worked at, what was that major takeaway you took from that Eric Ries talk?
Well, from that Eric Ries talk, what we took away was obviously the whole agile methodology and iterating and getting feedback as much as possible. Then there's this other nuance around psychological safety, which is that the quality of the decisions you make as a team depends on everybody's ability and willingness to share. And often the sharing, the best news to use is bad news, right? You launch something, you try something, gosh, that didn't work. That was terrible. Okay, well, what did we learn from it? And so I'm really interested in that space about how teams learn and adapt to the information they're gathering.
And of course, psychological safety is the topic of today's episode, and we want to dive deeper into that. But let's establish, let's say, the groundwork for the discussion that is coming up. So in your own work that you do with teams and organizations, how do you define psychological safety?
We use the definition provided by Amy Edmondson, and we've developed our own. So the definition by Amy Edmondson, who is a Harvard professor, she's really popularizing the term psychological safety. She's been researching the topic since the 90s. The late 90s is, I think 99 was the first paper she ever published, and has been writing books and so on. So I really consider her the foremost thought leader in the space. And her definition is that it is a belief that within your team, you can speak up, express concerns, share ideas without the fear of reprimand. And the definition that we use, which is very similar, is, and yet we find it a little bit perhaps more easy for people to digest, is that it is the courage to speak up and the confidence to know that you'll be heard. And so for a leader or a manager or a Scrum Master, the idea is you need to create an environment where everyone has that, where everyone has the courage to speak up and the confidence to know that when they do, they'll be heard.
And I think those two parts are very important, right? Because it's we've all been in a team where there was somebody who had no problem sharing bad news and sharing crazy ideas as well as good ideas. Typically, those people don't really care what others think. They just think their ideas are always the best, and they're happy to share. And they don't really care too much, and the team kind of just accepts it, right? Like that person out of left field that just comes up with ideas and is always sharing. But I think that what you're referring to is in the context of the team, right? It's not that one person is able to do this, it's that everybody in the team has the courage to speak up and the confidence that they will be heard, right?
That's right. That's right. And I believe there's some data out there. I can't cite any sources at the moment that suggest that the best teams have roughly equal representation when it comes to speaking. So there isn't one person just dominating the floor all the time.
Yeah, and obviously in this podcast, we talk a lot about teams and how to help teams succeed. And in your work, you've put quite a lot of emphasis on exactly that, helping teams succeed when things seem to go against them. So what have you learned about that? What part does psychological safety play in the storyline of a team that is facing adversity?
Well, I think most Scrum Masters or individuals within an Agile team can relate to when the stakes are low, when things are going well. It's easy to manage a team. It's easy to lead folks when, hey, we're all getting along, things are going great. When the stakes increase, when there are interpersonal conflicts, that's when it gets a lot more challenging. Because as a leader, your job is to facilitate outcomes from this team, so that you need to encourage the team and work with the team to produce outcomes. And so what we've seen is that the best leaders are the ones that can really facilitate growth and development of that team when the stakes are high, when personalities are strong and don't always agree. And the skills that we see are these skills of maintaining empathy and the ability to kind of relate to everybody on the team. And when you see that people within the team are in conflict or don't always agree, the ability to approach that interpersonal rupture, if you will, in a skilled way that opens the discussion and without necessarily putting blame on anyone. So facilitating discussion about the process of how the team is working, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And if like one of the topics we talk about a lot here on the podcast, typically on Monday, but it also happens on Tuesday. Monday is kind of when we talk about our own failures as Scrum Masters. Tuesday is when we talk about what happens in teams that kind of, derails the team. One of the things that we very often talk about is this idea that conflicts need to be managed very early on, not necessarily to be controlled, because sometimes conflicts are just natural part of the evolution of people's relationships, and they can be healthy in terms of bringing up things that might have been repressed in the past, but of course they need to be managed in the sense of making them constructive. Now, obviously, when there is a conflict, we need to create psychological safety for the people involved in that conflict, right? So that's a very common thing that we have to deal with as Scrum Masters. When two people are kind of, bumping heads with each other, we need to create a moment of safety there so that people can talk, but, they can express what's going on without necessarily getting at each other's throats. What can we learn about that? And from your research, are there like some tools, some experiences you can share for Scrum Masters that very often need to deal with that emerging conflict between two people in the team?
I would say the skill that I would recommend in that particular situation is what we call reflecting process. So as the Scrum Master, what you want to do to reflect process is notice. So first is be attuned to that conflict and how it might be affecting others on the team. And so all you're doing is you reflect that back. You say, I'm noticing that you two seem to be bumping heads. It doesn't feel productive. And I'm starting to get really frustrated. And perhaps others are too. What's going on? So you see how I'm approaching the conflict. I'm not necessarily pointing the finger saying, hey, you're being a jerk and you're not listening. Instead, I'm just bringing a sense of curiosity to it. And I'm also shining a light on the conflict so that everybody else on the team can say, yes, finally. Because they're probably feeling frustrated. They're probably feeling some sort of resistance to what's happening. And you just need to shine a light on it so that everybody goes, yes, that's the elephant in the room. I'm so glad you highlighted it. And then you broaden the discussion so that the team can work its way through that conflict.
Yeah, and one of the things that you just said, I want to highlight because it's very important from our perspective as Scrum Masters, that a conflict between two people is never only about those two people. Of course, it's about those two people. Perhaps it's a lot about those two people, but it's also about what it causes in the team, right? Like there's a bad atmosphere immediately if two people start shouting at each other in a meeting. Right. And I really like the idea of bringing the team in to the conversation so that people can start talking about the conflict as if it was a third person in the room. Right. Like it's not me and you. It's OK, I hear this. I think we failed in this thing, or I think we need to learn about whatever, like, communication with the marketing team or whatever the problem might be. How do you feel about that? Like slowly bringing in also the whole team to the conversation?
Absolutely. That's very astute of you to notice, Vasco, because what we see is so many managers will want to look at that conflict and take it offline. Say, you know what? Hey, Jim, Nancy, I'd like to talk to you guys separately, because they feel that stress or the anxiety about perhaps feeling like they were throwing someone under the bus or really, pointing the finger at someone in a negative way. And they're not wanting to do that publicly, but that conflict is public. It is, everyone sees it. Everybody notices. And as you said, there's that ripple effect. There's that rupture that everybody notices, and it will determine how much psychological safety people feel in the future. So if you can address it in the moment, we really think that's the best approach for a leader.
And of course, when we talk about the team, we are no longer talking only about one person, right? Like helping one person or even helping two people. We are talking about something that is wider. And you've also done a lot of work in counseling. So before we dive into that and how that relates to psychological safety, describe for us what is different between coaching and counseling.
Yeah, well, I've actually done a lot of work in coaching, first of all, so I'll maybe flip the question around a little bit. And as I mentioned, our initial startup was this idea of having two people coach each other. So we pivoted and we've started delivering coaching services to individuals, to organizations, et cetera. And all the while we believed in coaching, but we were also healthy skeptics, wanting to bring an evidence-based, research-based philosophy to our business. And so we wanted to not just deliver coaching, but we wanted to understand it. Why does coaching work? And if everybody who's listening here today is familiar with coaching, hopefully they also recognize that coaching is relatively new and as a profession, whereas counseling's been around for a lot longer. And as such, there's a lot more research and evidence. And we looked at coaching and counseling and saw the parallels. They're not the same thing, but there's an awful lot of parallels, and maybe we can learn from those. So we looked at the evidence that comes out of the research in counseling to understand, how do we make coaching better? And how do we help teams be more productive by the research that we find in counseling? And so what we found in counseling is that there are a whole bunch of different types of counselors. There's people that are trained in various methodologies. And what the research suggests is one methodology isn't necessarily better than another. Having a methodology is important. And let's use the parallel to being a Scrum Master and Agile. It's a methodology. So you need to have a methodology and follow it. So that's the first point. The second point is that the researchers looked at all of the best and high performers who use different methodologies. And they asked, what's common among all of those high performers? And specifically, the high performers were measured based on the outcomes of their patients, of their clients. And what they found is that there's these things called common factors, or what a more recent researcher has labeled facilitative interpersonal skills. And so these are specific skills that they were able to observe in counselors when they expose those counselors to challenging stimuli. So they took videos of actors depicting challenging moments in a counseling situation. So not your everyday, easy stuff, the hard stuff. And they asked them, okay, please respond to these challenging stimuli in whatever way you feel is appropriate. They recorded those responses. Then they were able to code the behaviors that they saw in those responses to come up and give each counselor a score. And then they correlated that score with client outcomes years later, and it was predictive. So we know that there's a high association there. So again, remember, all of these therapists, or counselors rather, had a methodology, and that wasn't enough. What they needed is these common factors, these soft skills, their empathy, etc. And so that's where we think the knowledge that we discovered in counseling is applicable to business leaders, to Scrum Masters, etc. It's not just the methodology. You can't just be asking the questions because you could teach any Scrum Master what questions to ask. It's the soft skills, really reading between the lines, and not just asking the question, but asking in a way that really promotes people's sharing and sense of safety, so that they know that when they do share, it's going to be well received within the team. That makes sense, Vasco?
So one of the things I'm hearing is, of course, having a method. So the first thing for Scrum Masters is we need to think about what's our method to interact with the team and the stakeholder, right? Like maybe very simple thing. For example, when we enter a team, we do spend some time observing and asking questions to understand the context. We don't try to intervene or create an intervention in any way. We just listen to what is going on. And then a second step of the method could be starting by asking the team, what problems do you want to solve, right? Like, having some sort of way to develop consensus on where we want to focus, what are the problems we want to solve. Like, so these kind of steps would be kind of a process of intervening in a team, right? Did I understand correctly? That's step one, right?
That's right.
And then step two is developing what you called facilitative interpersonal skills. Like this part, I don't know how to do it. So what's your experience? How can we as Scrum Masters start developing those facilitative interpersonal skills?
Well, the way we do it is we employ the principles of deliberate practice. And so if you're familiar with deliberate practice, many people are not. So maybe I should provide a little bit of background there. Deliberate practice comes out of many years of research, primarily by an individual named Anders Ericsson. So he's a researcher, I believe he's Swedish. And he's since passed away, unfortunately, but he wrote a book called Peak. And in that book, he describes the methods that people use to become experts at playing chess and a variety of other psychological skills. He specifically looks outside of sports and music, because I think sports and music have well-established methods for practicing and training and improving skills. And he wanted to look at other areas that are a little bit more amorphous or a little bit less tangible. And for example, when you play a note on a keyboard, you know if you hit the wrong note because you can hear it. Whereas in a lot of other inner psychological skills, like playing chess, for example, you don't necessarily immediately know that you made the wrong move.
Yeah, and there's delayed feedback.
Yeah, there's delayed feedback, exactly. And in interpersonal skills within a team, there's often delayed feedback or no feedback, or you might get feedback, but you're misinterpreting what that feedback is saying to you. So we use the principles of deliberate practice to help people practice these skills. And there's 8 specific dimensions of facilitative interpersonal skills. So we look at, and I don't need to necessarily give you all of them, but I'll give you one of them, for example, is verbal fluency. So leaders that are best able to foster psychological safety in their team are able to approach challenging interpersonal moments with clear and positive verbal fluency. So their words come out well articulated and they're not stumbling over their words. We all generally feel anxiety. And when we do, sometimes our verbal fluency goes down, right? That's when we start to stumble over words.
That's a great point, because obviously the example we were talking about a minute ago in a conflict, it's very, I just heard this from an interview I completed this week, where the Scrum Master was sharing about his first major conflict in a team. And he said, I froze. I didn't know what to do, right? And that's an example of that missing skill, right? Perhaps one of the things we can employ and deliberately practice is to reflect back to the team. This is what I heard. Did I understand correctly? What do others think?
That's right. That's reflecting content. So I mentioned reflecting process, where, hey, I'm noticing conflict. That there's also reflecting content. Is this what you said? And the second one is reflecting feeling. I'm noticing tension in the room here, right? I'm noticing you seem to be really bubbling with anger or frustration or whatever it may be. Sometimes naming that emotion gives people the permission to say, yeah, I am frustrated. And that's okay.
And that's okay. Exactly.
That's okay.
Let's figure out why, right?
Right. Let's work through it together as a team, because if we just ignore it, then we're naturally going to want to go back to this place of what I call politeness, right? Where it's just, oh, let's just all be polite together.
Avoidance.
And pretend like the problem's not there.
Yeah. A friend of mine once told me repression is the strongest force in the universe. And that's one way to do it, right? Let's move on. Let's take this offline. Let's move on. Of course, we talk about this, and like this facilitative interpersonal skills are extremely important when we do our work, which focuses on collaboration, because collaboration is something that does not emerge until the conditions are there for it to emerge. Like simple things like we agreed that we need to do something, right? Like that's a very simple thing. If we don't agree, we can't collaborate. So that's maybe one of the things that is easier to tackle immediately. Do we agree on the content of the task ahead, for example? But there are also other aspects that require us to be very perceptive as to the level of psychological safety. And I want to take this into a slightly different direction than we've taken so far, because so far we've been talking about psychological safety as some sort of entity that can be somehow defined or assessed. But in my own experience, psychological safety is different from individual to individual. Like I was just saying earlier, some people have no problem sharing what they're thinking, even stupid ideas, even things that are off topic, and they'll just share it because they don't feel that there's any problem in sharing that. Other people will have extremely good ideas, but will be silent with fear of being perhaps considered wrong or that the idea wasn't perfect or whatever, right? So the level of psychological safety is different for every individual in the team. And that's something that I've always had a lot of a hard time kind of wrapping my head around, like assessing what's going on, because every team member is sensing what's going on in a different way and therefore defining individually their level of safety differently from each other. Like for Scrum Masters, what can we look at? What can we study or practice to be able to, I think, incorporate these different perspectives on psychological safety?
Well, I'll come back to the point you said earlier, which is that psychological safety can be assessed. And you're right. There is a 7-question survey that was developed by Amy Edmondson to assess psychological safety. And the way you do it is you administer the assessment to all of your team members, and then you get the results. You can look at the average. So you have an average score, and you also want to be able to have a better understanding of the individual scores. Now, we don't typically share those individual scores within the team, because then naturally everyone's going to go, well, who rated it really low? And, you're going to start to put on your curiosity hat or your, Sherlock Holmes hat to figure out who that person is. And as a facilitator, I would typically know those results. And I can also facilitate discussion, knowing who's rating it high and who's rating it low. And we often, it's really interesting, the dynamics that we end up uncovering. For example, you might find that within a team, psychological safety tends to be bimodal, where 3 or 4 people feel like they have psychological safety. They can say whatever's on their mind. And then you have 3 or 4 people who are not feeling that way for whatever reason. Maybe they're newer to the team. Maybe they're more introverted. Maybe they're a different gender, different race, different whatever. And so what we want for teams is to be able to assess it, but then discuss it and have that be part of your process, is to look at not just how are we producing outcomes, but what's our process? How are we working as a team? And I think what you were talking about, noticing the different ways that people perceive safety within the team, that's really critical. As a Scrum Master, you need to be highly attuned to the different personalities in the room and how they're interacting, not just your relationship with them, but their relationship with each other, and really dialing into that and being sharply attuned.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of skills that we need to develop to be able to understand and work on the psychological safety of the team, but as well as we were just discussing, also the different team members. For those in the audience that want to dig deeper, to know more, to find out, how can they develop themselves and how can they bring these aspects into their process as a Scrum Master, what's one resource you could recommend? Could be a book, a podcast, a video, whatever, but one resource that you think, okay, the Scrum Masters should really know about this.
You should really know about Google's Project Aristotle. Google asked the question that perhaps many of you are asking, which is, what makes an effective team? So it's very similar to the question that counseling researchers were asking, which is, what makes an effective counselor? And so Google had 180 teams internally. They ranked them all, and then they applied their data and statistical approach to assessing. So they asked themselves, what factors do we think matter for team effectiveness? And they went around the organization, asked executives and leaders, came up with 250 factors. Out of those 250 factors, none of them correlate with psychological safety, or rather with team effectiveness, until they came across the concept of psychological safety. Then they applied that to their data set, and lo and behold, it was the number one factor. So what Google has done, if you just Google Project Aristotle, you'll find their results. And they provide some really useful worksheets and exercises that you can do as a team to discuss psychological safety. So they provide some really great resources, and check those out. So just Google Project Aristotle, and you'll find some really good information there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Stephan, let's have one last call to action for our Scrum Master listeners out there.
Well, our website is zarango.com. So that's where we provide our training around psychological safety and interpersonal skills. So it's ZARANGO.com. And I invite people to check it out and reach out to me. I'd be happy to provide a free psychological safety assessment for your team. And we can debrief those results with your team to open up the conversation and see where it goes from there.
And where can people reach you if they want to reach out and take that generous offer?
The best place is through our website. So there's a contact us page, and mention that you've heard me on this podcast, and I'd be happy to connect.
Absolutely. So everybody out there, let's go to zarango.com and find the contact us page and ask for Stephan and mention Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, of course. Stephan, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun, Vasco. Thank you.
Hi there, Agile friends. Thank you for sticking around to know more about this year's Agile Online Summit. The summit will have 4 keynotes and 4 tracks you will not want to miss. The keynotes will touch on critical topics for us, from delivering on time to helping you to focus on sustainability. The 4 tracks are tools, so we'll focus on tools you need to excel at your job, but also your mission. We'll also have a track on sustainability, which is, of course, about people and their sustainable pace, but it's also about how do we bring sustainability to the products and the planet we inhabit. We'll have a 3rd track about happiness, talking about doing what we love and, most crucially, loving what we do. And finally, the 4th track will be live. It will be mostly hands-on sessions to help you roll up your sleeves together with the presenters. Oh, and we will also have a coaching clinic, as we usually do, organized to help you discuss and get inspired to solve the hardest challenges you face at work. This year, we'll have a special emphasis on interaction with your peers, so get your ticket and join the Slack at bit.ly/AOS 2022. As always, we have free tickets for anyone that wants to attend live, and the VIP tickets for those of you who want to keep the videos forever. So check them out at bit.ly/AOS 2022. I'll see you on the conference floor. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.